Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Backyard Gardens podcast. Hope everybody's having an absolutely fantastic day. And we're going to answer. Are we going to answer it, or are we going to give the tools to figure it out? What's the situation here, Batavia?
I'm almost certain it's the tools.
The tools.
Speaking from a pixelated version of myself.
Yeah. So we're going to give. This is about when to start seeds. Let's not dance around it at all. And this is an important time of year because it is literally go time. But before we get going, I want to say, welcome back to the Backyard Gardens podcast. I am Ben, and this is my co-host, Batavia. And we are here to help you with your gardening journey. So if you want to support the show, please do so by becoming an Apple subscriber or a patron, or buy some seeds from us. We have a code that is available for a discount for a little bit more time. It is YBBBB, and it'll get you a discount, free shipping, $35 or more. And check out our Amazon list. It has all of our seed starting stuff in it that we use so that you can get it for your seed starting shelf, and it will help pay for the podcast slightly, but it still helps us.
It contributes to it.
Yeah.
So we appreciate you.
It absolutely does, at no cost to you. But this actually came from, this is a question, and we had planned to do this, but I want to give the shout out. So this is from our Facebook community garden page, and it is, Jean says,
"Hey, Jean."
We're coming off of our break, so we may be a little rusty, ladies and gentlemen. She says, "When do I start my seeds? Simple and straightforward. I love it. I love it." So when do you start your seeds, Batavia? What's your...
Before you want them to grow.
So what are you starting with?
I mean, I think that at this point, and this episode is going to be primarily focused on spring, it's going to be things that enjoy the cooler weather, things that thrive in the cooler weather.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's... There's different levels of thriving in cooler weather, though, and we need to all understand that. And we've kind of, we harp on broccoli and cabbage a lot on this show, but they really are, I think, the true champions of the cool weather, don't you?
I mean, I think generally the brassicas.
Brassicas,
right?
Yeah.
Cold crops, right? Either name. The broccolis and the cabbages and all of those vegetables that are in those areas. Lettuces are a good example. There's some flowers that, because I've been reading up on some flowers, they're things that you're an internet search away from understanding whether or not they're a cool weather crop, something that would enjoy and thrive in the cool weather or not. One of the levels I'm sure that you're speaking of is things that will grow and mature and thrive in the cool weather, and then things that will grow through the cool weather, but will ultimately produce and be harvested once it's warmer. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky, at least it had for my mind. But things are starting to become more clear, because guess what? New year, new Batavia is loading.
Oh, so let me, just so we know, for all the people on YouTube, we are officially loading.
Yeah.
So we were talking the other day, and I could sense it coming in, and I wrote a note, and Batavia was tickled by it. So I didn't get the same effect today, though. I'm a little disturbed.
No, yeah,
it was a one-time gig.
It's been a sleepy weekend. Yeah. I've actually had a conversation for an hour prior to you. So I am trying to recharge as we get into this.
Got it. Well,
normally you're the first kind of intense conversation I have when we do these.
I am. Well, it's important when we talk about this is, we want to figure out why is it important to know when. I have, and this is from my mistakes in the past, where I kind of came across and looked at it, and I found out that across the board, we're starting our seeds too late. We're not, I think there's, and this sounds kind of smug and I don't mean for it to be, but there's a lack of understanding about cold temperatures and plants and what they can and can't take. And we want to figure that out, because once we do that, I mean, we've referred to this before as in like cracking the code. And cracking the code's really important, because once you start doing that, this will affect your entire, from your seed starting shelf all the way to your garden, to your harvest, to everything. And it's really important that we get that under control. So knowing when and really understanding what each plant can take and tolerate are really important. And then also how we can bend those rules a little bit and really make it so that it works a little bit better and we can kind of stretch it out even more. And I know that differently, like I'm in coastal North Carolina and Batavia is in
Chicago, Illinois.
So we're in two totally different growing climates. Now, our first and last frost dates are very similar though, funnily enough.
Yeah.
That sounded weird, funnily enough.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a real word, but that's okay. Yeah. Really good indications are right now, do you feel like your soil is frozen through and through?
Right now? No.
And even gauging about when this is, because we're going to be airing this pretty closely to when we're recording it.
So we have a couple days coming up where we're not going to get above freezing, maybe a degree or two. My soil still will not freeze completely, but it's going to be close. But then right away, it's going to warm back up and it's not. So that's the big difference between us is my soil does not freeze solid. It may freeze, but then it's going to thaw again. And so that's something that we can keep in mind as we go down this path as well. So
yeah. And for me in my area, January to February, soil is going to be freezing or frozen. And then once we get into March, heading into April, that's when things are thawing. And one of the things that we talk about when it comes to spring plants is plant as soon as the soil is workable. Well, that's never really an issue for you, right, in your area, because generally speaking, the soil is always workable, meaning it's not frozen, whereas it's different for me. So even though we have that first average frost date and last average frost date are pretty close together, it's what happens in between those dates that's really important, that influences when we're starting. And that's why it's important to know why you need to know when to start seeds.
Yeah, it really is. And so you said something that's very interesting. You said something about workable soil. And a lot of times you'll see on seed packets, like if the soil's workable, plant it. Well, as somebody whose soil for 95% of the winter stays workable, I'm here to tell you that's not necessarily the case. So don't get overly excited if your soil is workable. There are still other parameters that need to be met in there. And it's another thing too. It's the dark side of gardening. It's the marketing, the getting you to buy seeds. I mean, look, we sell seeds, clearly, link below. But if we tell you to plant your seeds at the wrong time, and they rot in the soil and you got to buy more seeds. I mean, look, this is the reality of the situation. So for years and I've done this for two different types of crops, my snow peas and my carrots. So in particular, snow peas. And all right, so right now, like we've discussed, my soil is absolutely workable. I can go out there, I can dig, I can stick my finger in my soil, I can do a lot of different things with it. And I could go put a seed in there right now. What I found, like even though my soil is workable now, if I wait about a month, that germination, because I've done it, I planted January 1st and then I planted February 1st. The February 1st seeds outgrew the January 1st seeds. The January 1st seeds absolutely did germinate, but they were very, very slow to do so. So
yeah, I feel like this is a little bit of a tangent, and I think that I want to lean into the idea that we're giving tools for people. My soil was workable on December 30th. That's when I planted my garlic. Cross your fingers and toes, right? So a month later, December 30th is when I planted my garlic. That's when my soil was workable. January 30th, a month later, it's frozen. It was a chance that it could still have been workable on January 30th, but that's not the point, right? So if I start planting things on January 30th because my soil is workable, let's just be realistic. the freeze is still coming. Because I was able to work my soil on December 30th, should I have put broccoli transplants out? No, I shouldn't have. Because guess what's coming after that?
Yeah.
Right? So remember I said between your average first frost date and your average last frost date, the weather in between those dates dictates what your planting should be and will be and what you're going to be successful with. We've talked about rarely, but talked about in the past, kind of that false spring feel. Yeah. And I don't want to dig too far into that here, but kind of knowing your climate, knowing the things that you're growing, and to your point earlier, the conditions that they prefer, they thrive in, that will do them harm. All of those things are pieces. And it's important to know those things to know when you're going to be successful. I had someone comment on the collard green video saying, when can I start my collards? Now, you and I both know that there's information I would need for them to give them the correct answer.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I'm going to be general when I reply because there are things I don't know where they are. If they're in the U.S., I don't know if they're closer to you or closer to me. And all of that matters, right? But I do have a general answer, which we'll cover off on in this episode as well to help guide them, right? Because a lot of this isn't going to be, this is exactly your date. Right?
No, we can't. So that's the tricky part. And that's the part that upsets a lot of people. We can't sit here on this show and give dates to cover every single listener. That's literally impossible. It's just, there's way too many variables. And even when you get a date, that date needs to be fluid to an extent, right? We've talked about weather and, the unsexiness of it, but it's everything. It's everything in the garden. Yeah. And so if we were to give you a date, hypothetical date, and say, plant your collards February 14th, and you put that in and you go out there on February 14th and it's going to be 5 degrees, but on February 21st, it's going to be 29 degrees, then you can see the difference. So every date needs to be fluid because there's changes. Now, just to say this out loud, we don't do zones on this show at all because they don't apply to vegetables. You can go ahead and turn off if you don't agree, but just hear me out. We went up
the rare perennial vegetables. Yeah, those couple of handfuls that are perennials. Yeah,
it's a perennial garden zone map. So that being said, what was it last year when they raised they readjusted
2024? Yeah,
in 2024. Well, I will have you know, since 2024, our temperatures have been in the previous zone's temperatures 4 times since then. So I don't know what that means, but just to kind of put that out there. So there's a lot to it, but what we can do is we can give you the tools to get you started down the path to figure out when to start your seeds. And this really applies to indoor seed starting. Direct sowing, it's different, and we're going to focus on spring right now. So these are your early spring seeds. We're not talking about tomatoes and peppers, but you can still apply this to that if you're super curious or anything, but we want to give you the tools to figure it out.
One of the things that I think is exciting for me when I talk about starting seeds, I'm one more step closer to understanding the dynamics of a particular plant, and then many plants, right? Many vegetables, many flowers, many fruits if you're growing those. So once I start to understand when I'm going to start something by seed indoors, that gives me the keys to how long something is going to grow indoors before I ultimately plant it out. And that puts me to the next step of, all right, once I plant it out, how long is it going to grow before it produces the thing that I want from the plant, right? Like I'm learning the life cycle of the plant. For years and years and years, I grew only through transplants. And I still buy transplants now, right? But for years and years, that's all I ever grew. I had no concept of the pepper plant that I picked up from the nursery, how long that plant had been growing. I just knew that it had a bunch of leaves on it.
Yeah.
Right? When I buy my broccoli plants from the nursery in the spring, I just know that it has 5 or 6 leaves on it and it looks green and good, right? So I didn't have the concept of like that's my and it's not root bound. Those are my qualifications. And so when I planted, I started to pay attention to, all right, I planted it. How long does it take before it produces broccoli? But that's not the full life cycle. And to be the best gardeners we can be, that's something that we should try to get our heads around. It comes in time.
Yeah.
Right. There's still a few plants that I'm growing actively, and I say, each year. And I say, well, hold on. How long before this is the teaser, average last frost should I be starting this? And then I go and look it up and there's the answer. Then I start to say it took me like a full season and a half to figure out from planting to harvest, expected harvest date. But that's why, again, this is all important, because starting them from seed, then planting them out, then harvest leads into what I'm planting next in that space.
Yeah.
So it's all tied together.
It absolutely is. And it's, I don't do transplants unless I have to. And that just kind of evolved over time. I did transplants for many, and I was the same as you. It was, I like the way you said it. It's green and it's good, It's like, it didn't really matter. But then once I started growing them, I realized like, those pepper plants have been growing for a really, really long time. Yeah. Upwards of like 10 to 12 weeks. That would be 3 months they've been growing. So, and then you have to factor in the hardening off time on top of that. Now, what I'll say about hardening off time is once they get outside and they get hardened off, they can stay in the pots for a while. So they're still actively growing, and they're going to be growing at a much faster rate because the sun's a lot stronger. So there is that aspect of it. And the other thing I'm going to say is if you want an actual start date for yourself, I do custom seed starting schedules for people. So you can email me below, give me your zip code, and for a small fee, we can get you a chart. But even then, they need to be tweaked and tested. And what I mean by tested is I can grow collards here throughout the whole winter, but it doesn't really do me any good at all to start them in the spring, to plant in the spring. And the only way to really figure that out, there's a couple ways. One is look at what most people are doing in your area. And the other is don't be afraid to fail and try. Try it and see what happens. I mean, what are you going to lose? You're going to lose a collard plant. So what? It's not the end of the world. That's just because yours is different.
Yeah. So collards, based on my climate and the temperatures throughout spring, summer, and fall, I can go against the grain. I can plant collard transplants in the garden. Technically I could sow them by seed, which I don't normally do, but I can plant collard transplants in the garden in April, the first week of April. And those collard plants will stay in the garden all the way up until past my average first frost in the fall. So they stay in my garden through spring, summer, and fall. And generally speaking, they're as tasty as you'd want from a collard green plant. Now, to Ben's point, cauliflower is a good example. I have planted cauliflower over and over in the spring, and I never really get a desirable head of cauliflower in the spring. Right. It's one of those things that I have a chart that says I can start them by seed on this date, transplant them on this date, and I can still watch the thing grow and look, it's green, it looks good. But then guess what ends up happening? That thing, probably worse than broccoli, that thing gets caught by the heat and ends up bolting. Cauliflower is a little bit more sensitive to the cold than some of the other brassica plants that we will talk about. So these are the things when it comes to like testing this out. I was one of the first consumers of the custom chart, and I took that chart because it gave me kind of the guardrails, right? It gave me the framework, and I've built upon it for my own growing preferences, the things that I like to grow. I've added some things, I've taken some things off. I am now continuing to adjust it based on my schedule, my availability, what I know to have worked in my garden. So if something says started on February the 15th, oh, I really like starting these things on February the 1st. I've learned that this thing, there's no harm in starting it that 2 weeks earlier.
Yeah.
In some instances, depending on the vegetable, I need to be more obedient when it comes to the start date that's noted, right? Some of these plants, you get down to your, March and April, your summer plants. Those things don't want to stay, not all, but some don't want to stay in pots that long. Squash is a good example of that. But I say all of that to say, you have the baseline, you have the framework with one of the seed starting charts, and then it's your job now. We're passing it on to you to then be able to follow it, make adjustments where it makes sense for you in your specific area. Because even in a zip code, there's some changes even in one same zip code,
Absolutely.
We all have these microclimates.
I've gotten a couple people, they send zip codes, and I'll go, and there'll be 3 zones in a zip code. And then I'll say, well, I'll look at it, because I tried to, and just going on a little, just to kind of explain how this works. And I'll look at it, and I'll look at the map, and I'll say, like, hey, are you close to this area? And they'll say, yeah, I'm pretty close to it. Well, then I'll go in from there, and then it's like, well, it's still in 2 zones. And I literally have to ask this person, which I try not to, is what is your address? So I can get, there was one, and California is the absolute worst to do these for. They were in right on the coast, and it was the coast was zone 10A, and then you get off of it and it was 8B or something. I'm like, okay, this is, and the reason why that matters is because their frost dates were completely different within a mile stretch. So, this really does make a big difference. I know we don't talk about zones, but, you can use it as a tool to an extent. But everything that drives planting seeds really comes from one thing, and it's absolutely your frost dates. Your first and last frost dates is what drives a vegetable garden, unless you're doing eggplants perennial or something like that. But typically we're all growing those as annuals, so it kind of works out that way. I will say that in the years that I've been doing this, and I've been tweaking it and tweaking it and tweaking it and changing things, carrots were another one. You can grow those. You can start them here in late September, early October, we can start them. And last year I did 2 sets. I did fall and spring carrots. Well, the carrots I planted in the spring caught up to the plants that had been in the ground for months and then past them. So this year I was like, I'm not even going to, because then it's just one less thing I got to worry about for fall. I can let that ground rest. I can put something else in that space. So knowing when things go in can help that, but then tweaking what season works better. And it's typically in the hotter seasons. Your cool season vegetables will do better in the winter, in the fall into the winter. And in the cooler seasons, they'll typically do better in the spring going into summer. Cauliflower. Are
you saying the cooler areas?
Cooler areas, yeah.
Yeah.
So cauliflower, I like that you brought that up because look, I've only gotten a cauliflower harvest in the fall. I can't even begin to look at a cauliflower head in the spring. It's just not possible. Well, I say that, but if I tweaked it, the issue is when it comes down to cauliflower versus broccoli, cauliflower is a little bit more frost sensitive than broccoli. It's a little bit more tender. So that kind of poses an issue. But, it's all semantics at that point. And that was just clearly 1 year I did it right, 1 year, or 1 year I did it wrong, 1 year I did it right. And then we just, if you get success, keep doing it. If you fail, don't keep doing that same thing over and over, because then you're just going to go crazy.
So your starting point then is if we're looking at spring, your average last frost date.
Mm-hmm.
We could say that across the board for anyone's garden. And the interweb with a quick search, what's my average last frost date? Most cases, if you're in the U.S., your zip code, postal code, what have you. And you'll get a pretty accurate, I'd say, response back If you're in the U.S. also, I've checked my extension service. Farmer's Almanac is a good resource, I feel, when it comes to getting information like that. And that is what you're building around, so that's when you start to apply some of the building blocks we've talked about and we will talk about. But that's your first important date.
Yeah, absolutely, especially for this time of year. Now, well, let's just get into how we figure it out. So you take your first frost date and your last. I get them every time. And this is such a bad platform to get them confused too. I
was writing some notes. I was working on a couple of things and I was like, final frost date. Is that easier to say? But I'm like, no, first frost date is also, that's going to be a tongue twister. So yeah, I get you.
Yeah. Last frost date. We got to come up with a better term, but at the same time, I don't think we should reinvent the wheel.
Spring frost date.
But you take it back and you say, okay, 8 weeks is typically speaking, 8 weeks is what it takes to put a seed in a pot and go to a transplantable transplant, except for a few plants. Okay. So few plants off the top of your head, Batavia, can you give us 2 for spring?
For spring, it could be, I'm going to cheat. Most flowers need longer.
Oh, yeah.
And for spring, I don't know that I have a second one.
Okay. So I can think off the top of my head for spring, and this is cool season, like rutabagas. You want them about a month in the pot, in the seed cell.
Something that's shorter.
That's shorter. Yeah, shorter. Flowers typically go a lot longer. And
just as a side note, there are a couple of factors. Days to germinate, right? So you're putting a seed in a pot. The amount of days that it's typically said that it will take to germinate, in most cases, most things we're talking about will show themselves vegetable-wise within a week's time.
Yeah.
When you get to flowers, and we don't spend a lot of time here because, the audience hasn't shown a lot of interest, although flowers are a love of mine. Some flowers can take anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks to germinate. So when you talk about a longer period of time, that's a real good indication as to why you're starting those, much earlier than 8 weeks. But there's either around that 8-week period, things that may take 10 or 12 weeks, things that may take more like 4 or 6 weeks. So that's kind of the base. And this information is readily available on most internet search. You do that when you're looking to purchase seeds and so on.
Yeah. And flowers, just to kind of impress how much more difficult they can be, sometimes they need cold stratification. Mm-hmm. So that's a whole nother process where it could be months before they germinate to prep the seed. But to go down the path of the vegetables, 8 weeks is what you want, but we're not talking about your last frost date. So like I plant my broccoli probably about 8 weeks. I put my broccoli in the ground 8 weeks before my last frost date. Same with my cabbage.
Okay.
What?
All right, let's break this out in a different way. So there is, when do you put seed to dirt?
Yeah.
Right? So there's that. And then there is, when is a thing that's been indoors when does it move outside? Right? And then there is, when does it actually go into its forever garden space? So those are kind of the 3 areas that we are talking about when we talk about timing.
Yeah.
Right? And clearly, because that's going to happen in succession, putting seed indoors in the soil, you're going to move it outside at some point, and then you're going to plant it. And I'm okay with working my way backwards from that. So your average last frost date it's pretty, like it's in April, right?
April 15th, roughly.
Yeah, mine is a few days later than that, but for simplification, let's call it April 15th.
Okay. Is
the date that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so April 15th, it was funny. I was thinking we should come up with a fake last frost date. There it is. So April 15th, but and so we know Batavia is the same, but she's not going to put her seed in at the same time. So we need to figure out what's a trigger to say, hey, this seed can go out as we look forward. And you can always use Batavia's absolute favorite website ever created, which is...
timeanddate.com. I feel like we broke up or something. I haven't talked about them in so many months.
It's that time of year to talk about them, though.
Yeah.
It's that time of year. Yeah.
So timeanddate.com is a great resource because I can search by my zip code and I can look at past weather. There are a bunch of other cool things like sunset, sunrise times, average sunlight for, a particular day, like all of that stuff. But for this purpose, if I search timeanddate.com and then put past weather, you should be brought to your city essentially. And you can look at by the filter 2023, 2024, whichever one you want to select. I'd look at April and what my weather was last year, April.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm at that point just trying to either prove my average last frost date wrong or right. And generally speaking, it's about right.
Yeah.
If I'm looking at an April 15th date. But I also want to look at what does March look like? Because that, for me, working my way backwards, April the 15th, for me in my area compared to Ben and his, what's the earliest that I want to put a broccoli plant out? So I'm going to start counting backwards from that. Now, you said 8 weeks for you.
Yeah.
Right? Again, his soil is much more pliable, right? His temperatures are not as cold, not as frigid as mine. I'd say about 3 weeks is a good spot for me in my area as far as putting something like broccoli or another cool weather crop out. So that puts me in the last week of March, right?
Yeah. Because, you got to think about the difference between you and I is I have a hard stop for broccoli,
What? No. Before you go there, let's just walk it all the way back. Yeah. So if I'm the last week of March and using young Ben's math, I'm planting it the last week of March. I want to harden it off when?
The week before.
Okay.
Really?
So now I'm in, let's call it mid-March.
Mid-March.
That I'm bringing things outside to harden off. And now we're going to put the math together of young Ben's about 8 weeks. So what we've done is we've taken our average last frost date, April the 15th for my area. And then I'm working my way back. So now I'm about mid-February, mid-January.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm in mid-January to start my broccoli seeds because that gives me 8 weeks of growth, taking me to March 15th. Then that gives me about a week to harden off.
Yep.
And that allows me to put my broccoli transplants into the garden the last week of March, which is just a few weeks before my average last frost date.
Right. And if you're watching this on YouTube and it looks like I'm rolling my eyes, I'm doing math in my head. So I'm counting back. And that's why I like to focus on 1st and 15th of the month because it's easy to go back 4 weeks. And
one more time to call out, like, I didn't notice it didn't look like you were rolling your eyes, but thanks for calling attention to that.
No, somebody would. That's why. But I'm always like trying to think because it gets really confusing as you go back. But
you could take that formula and it's different for you.
Yes.
Right? But if you're like me in my area, if your Januaries are like my Januaries, Februaries are like my Februaries, March are like my March, April, and so on, then you've just created the formula for starting your broccoli. Now we need to understand, we're not going to go there right now, but how many other plants are like that broccoli?
Right.
Right? There's work to do. Like you can create your own schedule, but there's work to do when it comes to that. And it was a gift to me. So I appreciated getting the chart to help me so I didn't have to go through all of those Google searches and so on.
Well, yeah. And I got to say what I was going to say. So the difference is, and because I'm saying 8 weeks, Batavia's at her point saying like 3 weeks ahead, she's putting her broccoli in. Now, the thing to remember is May 1st, it's almost done. Like it's done. We start getting warm really fast here. So it's a big difference. Now, where Batavia is, her spring's really low and slow. And I've often said this before. When I lived up in New England, I always said like the spring, like the seasonal dates, the dates that they fall on are for the northern tier of the country. spring what's the first day of spring?
Like March 20th or something
March
like that.
20th, right? So you would not think, like if you're getting freezing temperatures and stuff like that in March 20th, that it would be 80 degrees. That just doesn't make, but that's what it's like here sometimes. So there's a big difference. And I've often said this, and Batavia and I had this conversation on and off air, like for her spring garden can last way into the season. My spring garden has to be out completely. So if you're in the southern tier of the states or you get really drastic temperature swings, these are things to remember, and you can start pushing them ahead, your dates accordingly. And it's just each year, try it a little bit more until you find that sweet spot. And when you go into timeanddate.com and you start looking at it, you're going to learn two things. One, your memory is not as good as you thought it was. And two, it changes, it fluctuates. So you can get a cold weather pattern, and it can be really cold at your last frost date, or it can be really warm at your last frost date. And, for me, what ends up happening in my area is it almost tricks you. It's like, I don't have like my last frost date was like a month early, and then bam, you get hit with that frost again, or a succession of frost, and then it goes away for the rest of the year. But that's why we want to be very careful, and we want to be very cognizant on this show that we're telling you, like, this is for spring seeds, because there's still a danger that you're going to get a frost, and you need to be aware of that, because if you don't and you put your tomatoes out, they're going to get ruined. Yeah.
I do want to take another 60 seconds to walk broccoli through.
Hold on, let me set my timer. Go.
So if I'm planting out my broccoli, which the earliest, to be frank, I've ever planted it is the very first week of April, but we just walked through the scenario of me planting it out the last week of April. And that time frame makes a difference. So I would be growing that broccoli plant in my Chicago garden through April. So that's about 5 weeks from when it was planted through May. And once I get closer to the end of May, our weather is heating up, and I'm right on the cusp of make or break for the broccoli, because it's really sensitive to the heat. And make or break meaning the plant won't die, but the quality of the broccoli heads that I'm going to harvest could be impacted if I wait too long. So that's why it's really critical to understand the when and how early you really can plant.
Right.
I have more wiggle room in that than young Ben, which kind of goes back to why he's saying, he's starting it much earlier, because he can, and really he should, because that back end piece, we planted it out last week of March. It grew in the garden April, and then in May, I'm looking to harvest towards the end. By the time I get to those first, 10 days of June, I'm harvesting small broccoli heads if I need to, because they're going to start to be impacted by the heat that we're getting coming out of spring into true calendar summer, right? 75 seconds.
No, I have a question for you. In the first part of June, when you're saying they're being impacted by the heat, are they bolted at that point, or are they starting to separate?
They're first going to start to separate. Okay. They're going to then start to produce, instead of green, because I don't know, there's no other color broccoli besides green. So instead of just the green heads, you'll start to see the little flower. Yeah. Like it starts to look a little kind of brownish. That's the next kind of stage where that thing not only is going to start to bolt, because it's going to start to produce the flower, which ultimately will be the seed. That's going to impact the taste of that broccoli. Now, it's not as bad from my experience as like lettuce, how lettuce could go really kind of rank. It could be bitter. Broccoli isn't that, but it's not as delicious as those tightly formed heads. Right. And for me to have broccoli in my garden by mid-June, it's a real rarity. And so I've planted it the first week of April, but being able to plant it that last week of March could be a real win for me. Right. Right. It's a whole different story for collards.
Well,
for me.
To put it in perspective for you, and by June 1st, I'd be harvesting my broccoli seeds. Mm-hmm. Like, seriously, I would be harvesting dried seeds off of the plants by June 1st. So that's part of it. But you were saying about collards?
Well, I'm just saying that's a different experience than collards. Yeah. Remember, I mentioned collards can stay in my garden. Kale can stay in my garden. Even cabbage can stay in my garden through most of summer. something like broccoli, something like cauliflower, something like, and it's not just heading crops, something like loose leaf lettuce, that will start to bolt by the time we get to June. So if you're listening now and you find out you're in an area that's more like mine compared to young Ben's, that's why when we talk about you're probably planting later than you should or could, that's when that becomes important, because you're going to stand a better chance at planting earlier and getting a more quality vegetable out of that harvest.
Yeah. Yeah. And so as we get into the latter part of the show, we need to kind of just go across the board and start with the hardiest crops. And I do want to give a list. We're clearly not going to be able to give you, the actual dates right here. But what we can do is we can give you like the list in which you should start first all the way to the end. This is for only inside. So anything that would be direct sowed or is typically done direct sowed, we would not add into this. But, do you think you could give a couple, Batavia? Yeah. This is the fun part, because it's like taking the final test.
Yeah. So I'll give you 3: onions, celery, and then I'll toss in a parsley as a herb that prefers cooler weather.
Okay. Mm-hmm. You know what's funny? I would not have given either one of those. So
I know you wouldn't. Yeah. That's the reason why I gave it.
Well, and for me, the difference is the onions. I have to plant those in the fall, so it's kind of totally different. But yeah. So the first one is, and I'm just going to go from hardiest would be kale, collards, and then cabbage and broccoli.
Agreed.
And then what do you think is next?
I think that we get into the lettuces and your bok choys.
Yeah.
Something that enjoys cooler weather, but is not as hardy as things we've named earlier in the list.
Yeah. I agree with that too. And then also rutabagas and lettuces are right about the same time. I grow a lot of rutabagas. That's why I keep bringing them up. I know it's not a popular one, but that's just... Oh, and mustard greens. That's another one that can fall in between, right around the broccoli, somewhere between broccoli and lettuce. You could start your mustard greens too.
So if you're listening or watching, so between the groups that I named and then the groups that young Ben named, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention spinach and peas. So green peas.
So... You want to hear something about spinach? It's stupid. I started spinach inside. You know what I noticed?
Yeah, I have before too.
Just before we came on air, what I noticed? The damn thing's bolting in my house. It's got flowers on it. So, and I've typically only direct sowed it. That's why I didn't bring it up, because I'm like, but that's how you learn. You put it in there and I'm like, if it's bolting inside, something's wrong. So we're just going to move it out. But
if you've ever watched a video of someone, and that's a good note, I'm probably more inclined to direct sow spinach than I am to start it indoors, but I have started it indoors. And like True Leaf 1 is an opportunity for you to transplant it out.
Yeah.
You don't need a big bushy plant for something like spinach. And I think it may be the weather fluctuation, the temperature fluctuation. It's always going to be warmer in your house, if that's where you're starting things, for spinach that it really likes. So there is that.
Yeah. So all of these plants need to be started before what you want to ask about, which is peppers and tomatoes. I started my broccoli December 15th is when I started my broccoli. And then I started a previous set of broccoli November 15th, but that's totally different. That's for the greenhouse. But I do want to take 2 minutes and just say this. If you are doing this and you're trying to cheat the code, get it out earlier, a simple low cover will extend that by a week or two on each side of it. So I think that's well worth it. It definitely helps. I just did a video on Sandy Bottom Homestead about hardening off crops when it's still cold outside. And the low tunnel plays a big part of it because there's so much you can do with that. So definitely think about that, adding a low tunnel, even if it's just for hardening off and stuff like that. That stuff will help immensely with it. And then again, it keeps it warmer in the daytime, traps a little bit of heat. It will keep it above, we have to say this too. If you're trying to plant out and your low tunnel is 2 degrees warmer at night and it's 25 degrees, that's outside normally. That's a big difference. 2 degrees is groundbreaking it doesn't seem like much though, right? It seems trivial, but when it comes down to it, it can be life or death.
Yeah. But again, can't say it enough. These cool weather crops.
Yes.
If it's 25 degrees and you're trying to harden off a tomato plant and you put it under a low tunnel, you're going to have 27 degrees in a dead tomato plant.
Yes. And when you're hardening off too, just remember at first, if it's cold, pull them inside at night. They don't need to be out there and be in that. So take care of them, pull them inside.
The low tunnel also helps with even though you may have had a fan running on your seedlings when they were indoors, it could help with some of like the briskness of the outdoor elements.
Yeah.
The wind, it could, if you get a bunch of rain coming in, it could help with that because they're still babies,
Yeah, they're basically infants at that point. Okay. All right. Well, so with that being said, I do have to tell you that there's a tool that will help you with all of this. And simply, it's the Planter app. So it's a sponsor of the show. It's a longtime sponsor for a reason, because we live by the Planter app. It tells you the dates that it likes to grow in. You can put in your area and it'll tell you your zip code, and it will tell you when to plant it out. And when you have that date that says plant out March 15th, all you got to do is count back 8 weeks. But then you can use the app to go through and really see how long it'll be in there, what its companions, combative plantings are. This is drag and drop interface, square foot. It's the gig. I'm telling you. There's a link below to get you a discount. Use that link to get a lifetime membership discount, a very healthy discount at that, and be a part of the Planter app and use it to your advantage and use it as a tool to integrate into your system. That is the Planter app, the Planter app, and it's available on the Google and Apple Play stores. There we go. I was waiting. She was a little slow today. All right. Our listener.
I'm filtering my cool and heat-loving plants, getting ready for what's next.
All right. Our listener questions of the day. Let's see here.
We're opening it up with one and closing out with one.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we opened up with it's kind of a shout out, but everybody's, same idea. All right, Maddie wants to know, and this is from the Backyard Gardens community garden on Facebook, which is absolutely free to join. Come join our community. It says, what is the best way to prevent stunting? I've had this happen multiple times along with mold on the soil, but I don't know that it was a lack of airflow.
Hey, Maddie.
I know. I told y'all we were rusty, and I didn't even. I'm sorry, Maddie. I'm sorry.
Did you get the impression that this is outdoors or indoors?
I got the impression that it was indoors.
Oh, okay.
I got the impression because she said mold on the soil, so I would imagine that would be. But let me reread it, break it down. So it's happened with multiple times with mold on the soil. I don't know that it was from a lack of airflow. Okay.
Yeah, I'd say. Well, it could be either. Let's focus on the indoor of it all.
Yeah, indoor. So what do you think?
One of the things that I have, so I've started seeds indoors. I think this is the 6th year where I've started like a bulk of seeds for indoors, like all of my summer things. Some of my cool weather things, it's a different story for a different day. And one of the things that I am just now recognizing I need to get under control, this is probably year 2 of it, is the dampness within the area that I am starting seeds. And specifically, not the air necessarily, but the way that I leave soil damp. I got a bunch of fans last year, ran one of them, right? I bottom water, and I'm notorious for filling up, the trays with water in the morning. And then it's 2 days later, I'm like, oh, shoot, that water's still sitting there. So I'm inclined to think that she said that she doesn't think it's necessarily about airflow. But does that mean that, Maddie, you have a fan running? Or does that mean that maybe you don't have things planted, so closely together? Because both could be an impact. I'm thinking the soil is too damp.
Yeah. So there's a couple things there. I'm thinking, what I'm doing is I'm thinking about my seed starting and how I've seen this happen. So one thing I know is mold doesn't usually grow easily if it's cool, right? So I'm imagining that it's warm. So definitely too moist. I agree with that completely. Stunting is a part of stress. So what you want to do is, if you got the heat mat on there and you've got it covered, a lot of times what we do is we put a dome on it, and then there'll be a heat on it, and it'll create humidity. I literally, just before I came on here, I checked my pepper seeds. They're about 5 days old. And I took my chopstick that I keep up here, and I cracked the top. I propped it on the bottom and put the tops on so that the air would get in and out, and just kind of let that air recirculate out of there, because I noticed that it was getting not mold, but mildew on the perlite that's on top. So that's one thing. So we may manage this differently. If you have a heat dome, I'd say take it off once those seeds germinate. Yeah. I've not done that, and it's led to some problems. But the idea is creating that kind of greenhouse effect to get those seeds from the place of placing them in the soil to actual germination. Generally speaking, there's some plants that would enjoy the more humid climate that the heat domes present. But I think you're better off removing it. Not that Maddie said that they were using it, but removing it to create, again, that air circulating and to prevent it from being too warm and too damp. In my response, I didn't really address the stunting, so I'm glad that you came back around to that. Yeah, and so stunting is a measurement of stress. Now, there's also another part of seed starting that you kind of need to understand is when the seed germinates, it'll come up, and then it'll put its first leaves out. And I can't say it to save my life. Cotyledons. Say it again. Cotyledons. Cotyledons. I'm either like very, very strong and wrong, or I'm right. I'm going with you're right. So the cotyledons, strong and wrong. I like it. Strong and wrong. The cotyledons. Way to stand by me, brother. I appreciate it. Hey, look, arm to arm, baby, all the way. So when the cotyledons come up, they will. The plant kind of seems like it stops, and what it's doing is it's forming its roots. It's getting a little bit of energy from those leaves, those first leaves, and then they're forming their roots, and then they will start to grow. But at the same time, once you start to see those true leaves come up, that's when you should give it a very light dose of fertilizer, and that will kind of push it past that. And also, I mean, on the watering and seeds is a big, we couldn't do an episode on watering seedlings because nobody would listen to it. But if we can drip it into every single episode we talk about, we'd be better off for it. Yeah. So when you water them at first, there's nothing to soak up the water at all. Nothing. As the roots grow and they get bigger and bigger, they're going to start using up more water. So at first, I don't water my seedlings for like 2 to 3 weeks almost. And then they start coming. Then I water them, and then to let them dry out, you water them, and you keep that process. You can't. And I was guilty of this for a long time, where I would water on a schedule. I'd say, okay, every Tuesday and Saturday, I'm going to water. Well, what happened was I was drowning my seeds. I was having seeds rot, and I was just waterlogged. If you ever have that issue and they're waterlogged, just let them dry out. Let them use the water up. Turn the fans on and turn the heat on them a little bit, and it'll help get that water out of there. But it's just a stress mechanism. So whatever you're doing to stress it out, you've got to kind of do a Sherlock Holmes and figure out, why is it stress? What is the problem? Sounds to me like it's too much water.
Yeah, the thing with seed starting, it's not baking. It's not the specific science from the point of seed starting all the way until you're getting that plant outside. It's more like cooking, right? So you're going to make a few adjustments to your recipe, add a little bit more of this, a dash more of that, because the area that I'm growing in, where it's 67 degrees and the air is really dry compared to upstairs where I may have my seed tray and it's 70 degrees and the air is still dry, that's going to produce two different experiences for those seedlings.
Yeah.
And so the last couple of years, I've used heat mats more. And just naturally, when you think about it, it's producing heat that's feeding those trays and those seedlings. I'm going to need to water more because it's going to be drier. Now, this is where it's harder to tell. And for those that have experience with indoor house plants, you know what I'm talking about. Like, every plant doesn't need water on the same day. And you kind of have to figure it out as you go along to determine which plants need water when. Of course, you can look up some things about which plants are drier and can thrive in drier conditions. When we talk about these seedlings, they're almost always in so little bit of soil. Like, no matter what you're starting them in, like what kind of container that you're starting them in, there's always so little soil around those roots. And it takes practice, to be quite frank, to figure out what's enough, what's not too much, and then what's not too little.
Yeah.
They're less forgiving too, if I'm frank.
Do you bake?
I do occasionally.
Let me rephrase that. Are you a good baker? First of all, I ain't never got a pie or cookies.
Yeah,
or anything
I'm
like
not
that.
like Kelly when it comes to. I know she's the baker. I'm not that. So I have my grandmother's pound cake recipe, her sweet potato pie recipe. There are a couple of things I do in the summer. So I have like maybe a bag of 5 things that I feel like I bake and can produce.
I'm going to put this out into the world. I expect a pound cake for my birthday next year. Because that's like one of my favorites. It's a lemon pound cake. Oh my God. And I know all I got to do is like remove the lemon extract, but that's all I can produce for you is a lemon pound cake. That's all I want is a lemon pound. That's my favorite. Damn. Y'all, our relationship just went up a notch. But the reason, because, my wife, she's a baker. That's, she bakes and she can cook, but I cook as well. And the reason why I bring it up is because starting seeds is like baking. It's very
I disagree.
I think it's very precise. And I think growing in the garden is like cooking, where you can kind of be a little bit more free about it and do anything. But, you need to, when you have the seedlings, they need to be watered at the right time. They need to have the correct amount of water. But when you go outside, you get a lot of play.
The reason why I think it's different is because the same seed started on the same day in my seed area versus yours. If it was like baking, we'd follow the exact same recipe.
Yeah, okay.
And the reality is that it's not. The act of starting it, literally the act of how much soil you put in, how much you cover the seed with, like that's the only thing I'll lend to baking. Like that, that can be really precise. But once you get to the point of caring for it, like past day one, I think then we have a lot more play. And I do agree with you. The garden outdoors is much more forgiving because, that's the natural place that these things are going to grow in. So there is that.
Well, and you've got a lot more soil that they can work with and, water can drain and stuff like that. So it sounded clever when it was in my head, but I don't think it's clever now. I think you're right, Batavia. It's okay.
It happens almost every episode. There's something that, you say, and I'm like, you really want to take that back,
killer.
Right?
Easy.
I joke. Every few episodes.
But I hope, I hope that if your seeds are stunted, that you can, work around that, but understand that there is a growth pattern that occurs. I just went with that with my broccoli, and, I've been starting seeds for a long time. And I started a lot of broccoli seeds in my day. And I was like, man, they're not growing. I literally blinked and they shot up. It was just, and what's happening underneath is just, it's got to go through the process. So it's important. But I hope that answered your question, Maddie. Do you think we got it under control?
We got ours under control. I'm not sure how much we've helped Maddie. I'm sure you'll let us know, though. I hope you will.
Absolutely. Let us know.
If you crack the code, dude, this is for the entire audience. If you've had some struggle and you cracked that code, whatever it is, I challenge you to post it join the Facebook group and post it there.
Yeah.
Because like those are the answers I'm looking for. It's some of the things that you struggle with. You don't even actively realize you struggle with it. And then someone comes up with a solution. And you're like,
Yeah.
just that small tweak, you know?
And it's just a lot of times it's just a little bit of a timing, little bit, and you know, from anything. But don't forget this, everybody. We have a few things to remember. 1, you need to fertilize your seedlings. 2, you should be harvesting your cabbage when you plant your tomatoes. And 3, this is the most important. Okay, I want you all to pay attention. Remember, we learn to grow, and we grow for change.
Begrudgingly agree to 1. For number 2, absolutely to number 3. See ya.